Hi, my name's Haydon Perryman, and in this video I'll be doing a bio on myself, Haydon Perryman. So by core competence, I'm an accountant. I qualified around 1998 and I moved from accountancy into change management. So that's projects, programs, and the kind of projects and programs I was managing were regulatory, compliance, risk types of programs. Back in those days I was looking at things like Sarbanes-Oxley. I've been working on FATCA CRS programs since 2010, and I'm an expert in the field of FATCA and the Common Reporting Standard. So I've built up a lot of scar tissue around the area of change management, things you should get right, things you should get wrong, and the kinds of things that you'll never learn in a textbook, that you'll never see from book learning. I'm going to bring you real life experience of the area of risk, compliance and change management. I'll tell you what I've learned and how I've incurred the scar tissue and how that can help you in your careers as you go forward. In this module we'll be taking somewhat of an unorthodox approach. I'll be teaching a lot via the use of a game. In this context, a game called Risk. Some of you will have played it before, some of you won't have played it before. Some of you are intimate with the game, some of you are not quite even beginners at this stage. I'll be talking to the entire audience as if they've never played Risk before. So if you're an expert at Risk, that's great, that's useful. But I'll be talking to the people primarily who've never played Risk before and who aren't necessarily sure of why I'm bringing this game into this particular program. So why Risk? Well, the game of Risk is a great way of modelling real life experiences in a way that doesn't do you as a practitioner any harm and teaches you some valuable lessons. So in the context of a game of Risk, Risk itself is a very aggressive game. It's very adversarial. People have been known to fall out, albeit temporarily, over a game of Risk because it's so adversarial. And there's a role of diplomacy. There are promises that you make that you sometimes have to break. There are alliances that are formed and broken. And these things are true in real life. They're especially true, and I'll explain why in the context of risk and compliance, governance, especially at the moment, and I'll explain why. And really, I see the game of Risk as a metaphor for the kind of things you experience if you're a person who implements change in the risk and regulatory compliance in real life, as I have been and still am. So why is the game of Risk germane? Well, for example, when you start off the game, are you trying to conquer or win primarily the highest number of continents or the highest number of territories? Now, there are lots of different opinions about which is more important and what the best game strategy is. I will say there's no right or wrong way, but you may well take the view that at the beginning of the game of Risk, continents are more important, and that as you advance in terms of rounds further into the game, that territories become more important. And it's all about the number of armies you get, whether that depends on continents or territories. So that's one of the first questions you'll ask yourself as you open the game. What am I trying to do here? What strategy am I going? What tactic am I going to employ? Am I going to go after particular continents, or am I going to go after certain territories? You'll soon learn that you can't go after every continent at the same time, because there are opponents in the game who are also trying to take every continent or as many territories as they can. Also, your choice of whether you're going after continents or territories will change depending on how mature the game itself is. Said differently, the tactics that you employ will change depending on what round you're in and what's happening on the board and what your opponents are actually doing. And this is exactly what happens in the real world of risk and regulatory compliance. Also, one of the reasons I've chosen the game of Risk to teach these things is that, yeah, there are other games around. So, for example, chess. Chess is a great game, and yes, you've got an adversary, but Risk has a larger element of chance. And in chess, you only have one opponent. You can argue about whether your opponent is your opponent or yourself. I understand that, but in risk you have many opponents, and the same is true with the actual risk in real life and regulatory compliance in real life. So you've got the element of chance, you have the element of competitors, you have the element of alliances being formed, alliances being broken, you have the element of having to understand and read your opponents, you have the element of your opponents becoming weaker and more powerful, and you're faced with decisions to make given certain scenarios in exactly the same way that you would be if you were implementing regulatory compliance, say for a bank or a pharmaceutical company in the real world. So, for example, risk teaches you that you can't eliminate all of your opponents at once. Risk teaches you that you can't have all territories at once, or perhaps you can, but it's at an advanced stage of the game, and you'd have to be an incredibly good player. You can't have all continents at once. Again, you can, but that would happen at an advanced stage of the game, and you'd have to be an incredibly good player. And if you're an incredibly good player at the game of risk, the chances are that you've got a good skill set to be an incredibly good player in the real life game of managing true risk and regulatory compliance. In the game of risk, you've got finite resources. Also in real life, finite resources. If you can imagine the regulations and how you might apply regulatory compliance and compare it to the game of risk, here's an example. You've only got so many resources, and how you choose to allocate those resources in a real life game of risk and compliance will very much depend on the cost of complying with a certain regulation on, say, the horizontal axis, compared with, say, on the vertical axis, your perception of the probability of regulatory enforcement. Let me explain what I mean by that. So if we take, for example, the context of banks, you're going to look at the probability of regulatory enforcement and compare that to the cost more than, say, fines. And there's a reason for that. If a regulator is going to go after you, the main risk that you're trying to manage is reputational damage. That would be the, like, if you like, the lead indicator. The financial costs, say fines, are generally speaking, and I am generalizing here, not as great as the impact on the bottom line of damaging customer perception, capital flight risk, and that sort of thing. So what you're looking at primarily is the risk that the regulator will come after you at all. If the regulator will come after you at all in the short run, that would inevitably damage your reputation, and that would cause impact on the bottom line. So I'm not advocating here that you would make these kinds of resource decisions on the size of fines. That's not your preliminary risk. What you're really trying to manage here in the context of a bank is reputational risk. For a bank, reputation is everything. Customers can go anywhere else quite easily. Money can travel quite easily. A damage to your reputation is an existential risk. Here is an example that practitioners of risk and compliance experience on an almost daily basis. Let's just say that you've got a new stakeholder and they say, right, I would like you to make me compliant with a particular regulation. Now, almost always that statement is a massive oversimplification, and we don't even know whether they truly want you to be compliant. Let me explain what I mean by that. You don't know whether that particular stakeholder has an interest in this regulation for 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years. We don't know if their career is about to take them off to another geographic territory. We don't know if they're moving out of risk and compliance or that particular part of the business altogether. We don't know their true degree of interest. Yet at the same time, we can't say so because, hey, we're new, this is a new stakeholder, and you can't start off a new relationship, you can't build it properly by saying, do you really mean a word that you're saying? That simply wouldn't work. So there are a number of ways you might deal with that scenario. And one of those ways would include, say, the Moscow method. So it would include sitting down with that particular stakeholder and saying, what are your musts, what are your coulds, what are your shoulds, what are your most won't for now. So Moscow being must, should, could, won't for now. and in such a way scoring what their true priorities are. So what do I mean by that? Because it sounds a little bit, I was going to use the phrase academic, that's not the right word to use, but I want you to see how this can work in the real world. So let's just say that, okay, they want you to make, the stakeholder wants you to make them compliant with, say, FATCA. So what would you do in that scenario? You'd say, right, okay, so what do we mean by compliance, and what sort of costs are we working towards? What does compliance mean? Does that mean all of the IGAs? Does it mean US Treasury FATCA? Does it mean CDOT? Does it mean CRS? It doesn't matter whether you know what FATCA and CRS, CDOT and CRS are, but the point is that you're qualifying what your stakeholders asked you. And then in terms of time, you say, well, and when do these things have to be done? Now, again, I've still not really explained how you would apply this in a real world. But if you can isolate scenarios and say, right, what about if I could do this for you, but I go slightly over budget? And they say, no, you can't. You absolutely cannot go over budget. Well, what about if I could make you compliant, but you were ever so slightly late, or if the quality suffered somewhat? Now, if they're rigid about everything, if everything's important, of course, then nothing's important. You'll always find that if you sit and listen enough, that there are some priorities that rank higher in their estimation than other priorities. So it may be that they want to be FATCA compliant, but they want to be FATCA compliant more in some geographies and in some parts of the business than others. And this always needs to be established. So then you can find out what it is that they really want. And also, if you can get a detailed understanding of their requirements by asking them these kinds of questions, you may be able to find scenarios where you can deliver what they say that they want in a way that with a solution that wasn't the one that they first thought of. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you can, let's just say that they want to be FATCA compliant, but I don't know, let's say Model 2 or non-IGA countries are, they want to be compliant in fact in non-IGA countries, but that can wait a few months later. If you can find a way of achieving that outcome that has a different solution than the one they have in mind, and you've qualified them quite carefully, so you can achieve the outcome that they want, and you've listened to them carefully, and it genuinely is the outcome that they want, in a way that isn't the solution that they would have thought they would have gone for initially. If you can achieve that outcome in a different way, and your stakeholder objects to that, that either means that you haven't captured their requirements correctly, or they aren't telling you the whole. There's more that you could learn. So it's either they haven't they've articulated it incorrectly, or you've misunderstood. And it's always really important to understand this. So, for example, it may be that they want you to be FATCA compliant in all of these areas. Well, what they really want to be is popular with a certain group of stakeholders. So it may be that they want to be FATCA compliant, but more important to them even still is their own reputation with other stakeholders, their level of popularity, their perceived level of expertise. And so it may be that you can make them FATCA compliant, but the only way you can do it within the required time frame is to compromise that stakeholder's relationship with other stakeholders. This is the sort of thing you need to know about before you begin. So my key point is here that people don't always want what they think they want. People don't always want what they say they want. And sometimes if you give people what they want, what they've asked for, you'll be very unpopular. This is exactly the sort of thing you wouldn't find in a textbook. So I've been asked to explain this particular point that I've made. Be careful about giving people what they want. Sometimes giving people what they want can make you unpopular. So let me explain. Sometimes what people say they want is not absolutely what they want. So for example, someone might say to you, I want you to make us FATCA compliant within 6 months, but what they actually really want is to look great with stakeholder A, B and C. That's way more important to them than FATCA compliance. And if you are tunnel visioned, if you just aim for FATCA compliance in such a way that damages that stakeholder relationship with A, B or C, that you're unpopular because what they really wanted was the appearance of chasing FATCA compliance, and that was subservient to building a reputation with stakeholder A, B and C. My point here is that giving people what they say they want is a little bit naive. Often what people say that they want and what they really want are hardly ever the same thing. Let me give you an example. Let's just say that you've got a team you've got a big team, and one of your team comes up to you and says, I want a pay rise or I'm going to leave. I can tell you from experience that if this person wanted a pay rise and if he didn't get it they were going to leave, they've probably already left, they've probably already been to interviews, and actually giving this person just a pay rise will hardly ever solve the problem. It may well be that this person doesn't feel valued. It may be that this person believes that they're failing. It may well be that this particular member of the team feels that they've been dealt with inequitably. It will hardly ever be just about money. So one of the solutions here is to listen to what the person's saying hard enough to understand what they really mean. And what they really mean is hardly ever what they first say. Something else that you'll rarely see in textbook is the danger of getting things right, the danger of winning. When you're successful, if you're seen to be successful, it may well be that your competitors start to sharpen their knives. In exactly the same way, say the game of Risk, if you are perceived as a strong player, the chances are that many of the weaker players will gang up against you. This happens a lot in the area of risk management, the area of change, regulatory compliance. So if you're successful, be careful. If you celebrate too publicly, too loudly, be careful. People will start to sharpen their knives. Also, it may well be that you know what the solution to a particular troublesome area should be, but be careful about implementing it. And here's what I mean. Really, if you understand how to solve a particular problem and you don't take your audience with you, you can get there. You may well be a genius, but it will be analogous to this. Imagine you've got an apple cart and you're pulling it yourself, and that the people you need to take with you, they're like the apples in the back of the apple cart. If you can run and take the apple cart with you from 0 to 60 and get 2 miles and across a distance of 2 miles, that's great. So you pick up the apple cart, you run with it 2 miles, 0 to 60 in a couple of seconds, and you think you've won. The trouble is, all of your apples are out there on the road, and they're all getting mashed. And this is true of stakeholders too. Wear your expertise lightly. It may well be that you're an expert in a field such that a particular problem comes up and you know how to solve that problem in a short space of time. It may be that you understand, because of your expertise, how to solve that problem way better than some much more senior people in the organisation. But be careful about just solving the problem. Be careful about saying it's obvious. Be careful about displaying your level of expertise. And here's what I mean by that. You may well understand this problem better than anybody else. You may well have the solution to the problem. But if you implement your own solution without taking your stakeholders with you, they feel alienated. They didn't understand it was the right solution, and they feel like you did this to them. Also, if it truly can be seen that you were right all along and you didn't take the people with you along the journey, they may well resent it for you. It may well be better to work with other stakeholders so that they believe that your solution was never your solution, was always their idea, was clearly the right way to go. This may take a bit of time, but if this is not seen as your solution but as a group solution, then you get there as a team, you get there willingly, other people can take the credit, and you won't be resented. Killer point: wear your expertise lightly. One thing to remember about regulatory compliance is that there are no Olympic medals for complying with a particular regulation. So always bear in mind that if you say, like for FATCA, which I know very well, there are certain levels of compliance you can aspire to. I often call them gold-plated, silver plated or copper plated or bronze. Now, if you go to a big four firm, they'll always give you the gold plated version of compliance, but most organisations can't afford gold plated compliance, or at least they can't afford gold plated compliance for every single regulation written by every jurisdiction everywhere in the world all at once. Most banks certainly would go out of business if they tried to be 100% compliant in a gold-plated fashion in every jurisdiction, in every regulation, everywhere in the world. So always bear in mind there are no prizes for complying with the regulation. There are massive punishments potentially for not complying, but also bear in mind that sometimes there aren't massive consequences in the short term for not complying. It all depends on your assessment of what that of how that regulator will be in the next year or so, and that may change year on year. But always bear that in mind. There are no prizes for this for compliance. Compliance is a lot like electricity, by which I mean when you're compliant, nobody will notice. When electricity works, nobody notices. But when the lights go out, when the electricity doesn't work, when you're non-compliant, everybody notices. So there are no stars, there are no medals for compliance, but there are massive consequences sometimes for non-compliance. So it never makes sense to fixate on one particular regulation. When you're looking at a regulatory landscape that includes, for example, Dodd-Frank, EMIR, by which I mean European Market Infrastructure Regulation, whether it's MiFID II, Dodd-Frank, FATCA, CRS, CDOT, Basel 3 or 2, Basel 2329. There are so many regulations now that you wouldn't want to fixate on any particular one in isolation. And also bear in mind there are regulations having to do with having a strong balance sheet, stress tests. There are commercial pressures to improve the cost to income ratio. There are lots of competing priorities. So just to reiterate, there are no medals for compliance. A few summers ago, a major stakeholder of mine on a key project came back and he said to me, Haydon, there's one thing I'm looking for from all of my project managers this season. And I said to him, what's that? And he said to me, more soap, less flannel. And I asked him, well, what exactly do you mean by that? More soap, less flannel. And he said, well, soap is a summary on a page, SOAP. Flannel is like just loads of commentary that I can make neither head nor tail of. Now, I can see where he's coming from. He wants more, he wants, as he says, more soap, less flannel. And increasingly we're seeing now that the higher up you go, the organisational in the organisational structure, the shorter the attention span of the people in those higher senior positions, and for good reason. But one of the pressures that we face when we're implementing change is that the change is quite complex. It isn't a kind of join the dots type project, by which I mean you would join the dots, it's obvious which dot you should join next. With these regulatory compliance type projects, that's simply not the case. The landscape is changing all of the time. And so some of the work that we're doing is very cerebral. At the same time, I've got to acknowledge that the attention span of senior players is increasingly short. And oftentimes I'll see people with really big change problems to work on, and their biggest concern at that particular time is how to describe that scenario and potential solutions on 2 PowerPoint slides. Now, it's tempting to say that's absolutely stupid, and perhaps it is, but we have to recognise that the senior people with which we interact, they do, in fact, right or wrong, want a summary on a page. So this relates to risk management because you've got to simplify almost to the point of not quite bending the truth, but you can simplify so much. And if you're only left with two PowerPoint slides, you could argue, well, you could do that if you use an extremely small font. Of course, I'm being silly here. But the point I'm really trying to raise is that what we do is complex, but the people we need to influence haven't got time to absorb that complexity. With regulatory compliance, there is no such thing as a first entrant advantage. So, for example, if you're trying to comply with a regulation, that means reaching out to the customer. If you're the first bank to reach out to the customer to comply with a particular regulation, then you face the most reputational damage when, say, this gets into the financial press that you've been doing this and customers don't understand. And I have seen this with FATCA, where people are reaching out to the customer to get a W8 or an equivalent signed or filled out, and the banks who first make this move are the ones who suffer the reputational damage, where the ones who come later don't seem to incur any damage at all. So always bear in mind that with regulatory compliance, I've said before, there's no such thing as a gold medal and an Olympics medal, but you want to be in the pack, so to speak. You don't want to be you don't necessarily want to be the first mover. You don't want to be the last mover either. There's definitely safety in numbers, so do bear this in mind. And oftentimes when you're trying to see the top brass to influence them about this action that you believe should be taken next, I guarantee you the first question they'll ask you is, what are my competitors doing? And they'll expect you to know, and they'll place more emphasis on what their competitors are doing than almost anything else you can tell them. One of the reasons I'm using games to illustrate this scenario is that the games themselves are played by some very successful people. So, for example, if you look at Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, they're both famous bridge players. It's not very well known, but in the bridge circuit, on the bridge circuits, it's very well known that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are avid bridge players. And it's no accident, I would suggest, that they're amongst the richest people in the world, and that they're bridge players, and they understand probability and chance, working as part of an albeit small team in that kind of a scenario. And Warren Buffett is often said that, well, it's said by, I think, Charlie Munger, his, I don't know whether he's his current business partner or a former business partner, but Charlie Munger has said that Warren Buffett only actually owned a computer to play bridge online, and apparently his online bridge alias was Peter Lynch. He'd never seen Warren Buffett use a computer in any other context, and he'd certainly never seen Warren Buffett do a net present value based on a discounted cash flow or the time value of money using a computer. So it may seem ridiculous to you that I'm trying to teach this module via a game, but some of the wealthiest and most successful people play games too. Another thing I should say is that I learned to play Risk in my early teens. My father taught me to play Risk, and in my early teens, mid-teens, late teens, all the way through to my very early 20s, me and my friends, often used to play Risk on perhaps a once a month basis, very late into the night and into early morning. I don't ever remember beating my father. My father was known as the best Risk player on my particular circuit. I was always the second rated Risk player, second to my father. But what I hadn't realised was why he was winning. Now, my father used to spend hours just studying the board game, even when he wasn't playing the game, studying the game, the cards, the rules. And I really had no idea why. And I just hadn't figured out that he'd worked out the sorts of things that are in this book. This book goes along with the course, and what can I say? The reason he kept winning was that he had probability on his side. A lesson for us all there is understand the probability, the percentages, have a strategy, and as both my parents have often said, and they're both bridge players, the thing is to plan your play and then play your plan. One of the things my father often used to say to me was that life isn't always about playing your trump card, it's often about avoiding the tricks. And that's true in real life too. Now, I'm encouraging all of the students on this particular program to play the game, where possible, face to face. There are reasons for this. It's a game where it can get very heated, and my understanding is that at this point of the course, you won't all know each other well, and so this is a good excuse for you guys to get together and play a game, get to know each other. I do understand that that's not always going to be possible for every single person, but please play the game. If you're going to play it online, then please play it using the board game and be able to see each other's faces. I wouldn't encourage you to play online where you can't see each other's faces. I do really want you guys to get to know each other. And part of this module is about teaching you the importance of reading each other, forming alliances, breaking alliances, and all of the stress that goes with that, the personal management of your own emotions that you have to do. So I really do encourage you when you play this game to be able to see each other face to face. Also, please, on this particular module, no use of bulletin boards. On other modules, I would encourage it. Just this particular one because for two reasons. Risk is adversarial, and because you guys don't know each other that well yet. Add a third, and that is that if you're anything like me, you're more careless with electronic language than you would be face to face. This concludes my notes on this particular subject and this introduction. Please, I hope you have some fun playing the game of Risk, and let me know what you've learned. Thank you.